So President Bush was very much committed to being a kinder, gentler president, right? Like that's what he said about his administration. And early on, there was some sign that he was going to support modest, improvements in the American society by micro targeting money towards groups that were like firefighters and things like that. So sort of small block grants. And really, the big question was for President Bush, and it totally fits in his personality, demeanor, experience, that it would be foreign policy. Of all presidents to have as our leader during foreign policy, H.W. was the perfect president for that, because he was not a brash, sort of arrogant figure. He was a humble war hero. He was very calculating and smart. And so he is going to, be dealing with what's sometimes now called, and you should be familiar with the phrase, the peace dividend. So what is the peace dividend? Well, it's an interesting concept because we have been spending anywhere from 10 to 20% of our GDP for the better part of 50 years on military spending, right? And now the Cold War has ended. And so President H.W. Bush will be the first president to be able to push and support, actually, large numbers of military base closings. So you'll see here, 34 base closings. All right, a $52 billion order for a Navy attack plane is canceled. He closes a lot of California defense plants. And the reason is they cut the military budget. There's absolutely no need to justify a military budget in the trillions of dollars without a Cold War opponent, and so he's going to do this. Now, this is actually going to have a recessionary outcome. And so I want to take you back to President Reagan for a minute. So if you think about President Reagan, he had always been a vocal critic of Keynesian economics, right? Like, you guys remember what Keynesian economics is, where the government stimulates the economy and stuff. The irony is most of his presidency was actually Keynesian, because it was the federal government spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in the military industry, the very military industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about. So when we start reducing those, and this is going to be the reality of America today, y'all, if we cut the budget, 20 to 25% of the American economy today comes from the federal government. So we have to go through some pain in order to move away from giant federal budgets. And President Bush, when he does these cuts and when Congress makes these cuts, it's very painful, in places like California, in places like Virginia. And so when these military bases are closed, that's a lot of military money that's no longer being pumped into the economy. And so we have a sort of recession as a result of this. The last year and a half of President Bush, the economy will be in a downturn. But I think he made a good decision here, because do we really want to just spend federal money on, by the Pentagon's own standing, unnecessary bases and weapon systems and things like that? I mean, shouldn't there be other ways to stimulate the economy other than this, particularly because you can't really do much with military spending other than fight? It doesn't have much other purpose. So this is an important moment of the peace dividend, and it is really going to come to fruition fully under President Clinton's economy. Now, during this, President Reagan had really, and I have a long story I tell about apartheid and how I became a global citizen, but unfortunately, I don't have time for that today. But needless to say, you may recall there was a Cold War struggle going on in Angola, right? The Cubans and the Soviets were propping up a communist regime in Angola. And so this country, South Africa, had been our base of operations against Angola. The so-called Democratic Government of South Africa was fighting in Angola. So South Africa was our ally. The problem was South Africa was a brutal racist society under apartheid. It had been since the end of World War II. The Dutch descendants and the English descendants were about 20% of the population, and they ruled South Africa like with Jim Crow, in essence, only they called it apartheid. And the difference between apartheid and Jim Crow is in America, African Americans were the minority in these states, by and large. In South Africa, overwhelmingly, the majority of the people were mistreated. I mean, the majority of the people were segregated. And the group that led the resistance to apartheid was the ANC, and the guy who'd been in prison for 27 years was Nelson Mandela. And so when Mandela was freed and elected president of South Africa, that was a huge moment in the world's history, in the world history of progress particularly for that country. So be aware that event happens. Now, it's not directly related to President Bush. It is somewhat directly related to America because during President Reagan's presidency, Archbishop Desmond Tutu had asked America to boycott South Africa. And ultimately, Congress had passed a law to boycott South Africa, that embargo South Africa, even though they're our ally. Reagan had vetoed it, but Congress overrode the veto. And so we had been putting enormous pressure, sanctions on South Africa, and that led them to end apartheid, which is kind of useful foreign policy there. But by far the biggest challenge to President Bush, keep in mind, the Cold War has ended. It ends in 89 and 90, like in that year. And almost immediately at the end of the Cold War, Saddam Hussein goes off the reservation. Now, Saddam Hussein, ironically, had been our sort of ally. Here's future Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld engaging in an arms deal with Saddam Hussein, who from 1980 to 1988, so all of Reagan's presidency, Iran and Iraq had been at war with each other. Okay. And we had provided weapons, to help the Iraqis fight the Iranians. But in 1990, Saddam decided to invade Kuwait. And Kuwait is just a tiny little country down here, but you can see it controls almost all the access to the Persian Gulf. It's a very, very valuable location. Lots of oil pipelines come out in Kuwait, right? And so Saddam invades Kuwait and claims that it's the 19th province that was taken from Iraq at the League of Nations, at the Treaty of Versailles. And he demands that Kuwait be, in essence, annexed to Iraq. And President Bush very quickly states that this aggression will not stand. Like, he will not allow a sovereign nation to be invaded by another sovereign nation, right? And so very quickly, President Bush organizes a coalition of dozens and dozens of countries, most famously the Brits, the French, but the Saudis, lots and lots of countries join in on a first defend of Saudi Arabia. So the concern is that Saddam's going to invade Saudi Arabia. And that of course, is our ally and the source of a lot of our oil. So we go in first with what's called Operation Desert Shield, which is a defense of Saudi Arabia. And then we launch Operation Desert Storm, which is the 100-hour war, right? This is the war that very quickly, once we have secured our border, Saudi Arabia's border, you can see we launch a full-out assault on Saddam's military, and we utterly obliterate it. I mean, in retaliation, Saddam's forces will retreat. We'll shell them and blow them up. And he'll set fire to the oil wells in both Kuwait and Iraq. So you have this terrible. He also opens up the oil pipelines in Kuwait directly into the Persian Gulf, utterly destroying the wildlife there, the habitat there. So it's like eco-terrorism. So Saddam is routed. I mean, his military is utterly annihilated in basically 4 days. Now, these are the two commanders, and I certainly would like you to be familiar with them. The man who is the field commander is Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. This is General Schwarzkopf, the fellow on the right. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's the guys that run the military back all the way since 1947, since the National Security Act of 1947, is a fellow named Colin Powell. Now, Powell will appear later as the Secretary of State to the United States under President W. Bush. And it's Powell who I was talking about, the Powell Doctrine. Remember, you got to have clear exit strategy. You got to have clear victory objectives. So he's the guy. These are the two guys who learned in Vietnam. And you want to talk about a spectacular victory. When first of all, we bombard, and this is a UN action, by the way. It's not just, it's US led, kind of like Korea, but it is a UN overall action. And we're going to annihilate the Iraqi military, the Iraqi tanks. Iraq is going to try something that's interesting. They're going to shoot missiles, they're called Scuds, at Israel. They're trying to, in essence, entice Israel to attack them. See, if Israel attacks Saddam, if Israel attacks here, then all the Arab friends that we have in this coalition will drop out. because the Arabs don't want to be on a team if Israel's on that team, right? So Israel doesn't take a bait. They don't go for like they don't fight with Saddam during this war. So it's very clear that during the war, Saddam had developed biological and chemical weapons. He would use them on a group of people in the northern part of Iraq called the Kurds. Live up this way, Kurds. And so, we were very thrilled at how quickly this war was resolved. Now, there was a debate about should we go up the highway of death. You can see where all these red tanks get utterly annihilated. Their tanks they meet our M1A1 Abrams and get annihilated. They meet our air power. And I told you this war, in many ways, was a perfect war because we had the absolute best possible military equipment in history. All the best of the Cold War, right? We had overwhelmingly support by allies. Most Americans fully supported this war, and it was quick. In fact, it was over so quick that President Bush is going to lose the victory dividend. He had a approval rating of over 80%. I mean, that's like Democrats like this, 80+%. And by the end, he's going to be a one-term president because the war was over so fast. And I think that's interesting. So anyway, be aware of Operation Desert Storm. I don't think you'll have to know much about this, but it was a very sort of great post-Vietnam win. Vietnam had been weighing on the generation of Americans from the 70s through the 80s. We hadn't really fought a major ground conflict, and so we still had the sort of specter of Vietnam. Well, we won this war so splendidly, they kind of erased Vietnam kind of out of the memory of the time. But as I said, there is a debate about what should we have done with this guy. Now, I've read what Bush argued. Now, several of the people around Bush really wanted us to march on to Baghdad and depose Saddam Hussein in in 91. Bush, being the expert that he was on foreign and world affairs, believed that would change the dynamic of the war. It would be a war of occupation. It would become much less popular, right? And perhaps just as bad, if we get rid of Saddam, then that creates a destabilizing influence in the Middle East because the largest people in Iraq are Shiite Muslims. And Saddam was able to kind of keep the lid on that group with his dictatorship. If he were removed, the theory was by President Bush that the Iranians would then just basically take over Iraq. And that's kind of like where we are today after we depose Saddam, and it's because of population. I mean, like 70% of the country's Shia, so that made sense. And so we leave Saddam in place. Now, in the words of President Bush and President Clinton, we put him in a box. And by that, I mean there was a no-fly zone over Iraq. He couldn't fly planes anymore. We banned his chemical and biological weapons and made him destroy them. We enforced their development of any other kind of weapons with inspections. So basically, it's like Saddam was there, but that was it. He couldn't do anything else. And that's kind of how we resolve this. That's how we leave it. Okay. But of course, one of the lasting legacies of this is there's a young man named Osama bin Laden who wanted to use his forces to protect Saudi Arabia, this group called Al-Qaeda. And he will become absolutely, and not just him, but he will be outraged by the presence of Americans, infidels, in the Holy Land, in Saudi Arabia. And he will use this as one more, moment to build up his propaganda, I guess you'd say, against the West, against the U.S. Now, I told you that President Bush wanted to be a compassionate, kinder, gentler kind of America. And one of his greatest bills from his perspective was the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if you think about wheelchair ramps and, we have an elevator here and making things handicap accessible is the old way of saying it. This was a profound change in whose rights should be protected. Citizens who are disabled should be able to go into their city hall or into their courtrooms without being, without having to be lifted up and carried and stuff like that. So ADA is still on the books. It will later have an education amendment attached to it called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and that creates nationalized federal uh, special education. So if you've heard of like special ed, that will come out of this. And so he seems to be fairly moderate on some of his domestic policies. One of the worst things that's going to happen during his presidency is, at the time, the worst environmental spill in history. Now, this one has since been eclipsed by the Deepwater Horizon British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf. But a captain, a drunken captain of a oil tanker ran it aground, and it spilled oil out into the pristine Puget Sound of Alaska. And so this was the Exxon Valdez, which was a really terrible eco tragedy. And you can be aware of a sequence of these that start to occur even more and more in the 20th century. Now, President Bush is going to run into what he did not expect, just like virulent opposition to his Supreme Court nominee to succeed the outgoing Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African American on the court, retired. And, critics today would say you shouldn't retire if you're liberal during a Republican or vice versa, right? But he did. And so I think in order to keep sort of representation, President Bush, was very pleased to discover there was a deeply conservative African-American judge, federal judge. And so he nominated Judge Thomas from the U.S. Court of Appeals, a man who was clearly qualified. He's on the appellate courts already. Judge Thomas, Clarence Thomas, is very, very conservative. He's like Chief Justice Rehnquist. He'll be like Justice Scalia. And he is still a conservative on the Supreme Court today, by the way, just FYI. And when Judge Thomas's hearing is going along, he's facing an enormous opposition from the ACLU, like the ACLU, which normally doesn't openly oppose Supreme Court nominees at that point in history. And perhaps even more surprisingly, the NAACP. So here's the most famous Black organization in America opposing a Black nominee. And the reason is because he's like super conservative. He is very much the role of that. So during the hearings, it comes to light that while he was working in HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, Judge Thomas was accused of sexual harassment by a lady who is now a law professor down at the University of Texas. Her name is Professor Hill, Anita Hill, and she charged that Thomas had, on numerous occasions, discussed inappropriate sexual things with her, and because he was her boss, she felt like she couldn't do anything about it, right? Now, at that time in history, sexual harassment was still kind of a gray, it really wasn't a thing yet. Like, in other words, people didn't usually expose people for it, and people didn't usually get in trouble for it. But the times were changing, and it was particularly changing because the Senate Democrats could utilize this to try to embarrass Judge Thomas. And again, we have Judiciary Chairman Joe Biden, who is going to lead the hearings with Judge Thomas. And Biden is just going to grill Thomas, like take him over the coals. He's also going to be really tough on Anita Hill, too, though. And later on, he'll get some scrutiny from this, from African-American women particularly, and the way he kind of handles it. But, yeah, nonetheless, they grill Thomas. Now, I'll be honest with you. This Democratic-led Senate will later vote for people like overwhelmingly, like unanimously, that are Republicans. Anthony Kennedy gets elected like 97, confirmed 97-0. It was Reagan's replacement for Bork, right? But and when it came to this one, man, this was a televised drama. And I mean, all day long it was on TV. They called it the Anita Hill testimony the last 2 days because she was actually subpoenaed, and they discussed some pretty graphic stuff, and this was on daytime television. People were watching it. But in the end, Judge Thomas was confirmed, and he was, he became and is a Supreme Court justice. But ever since the Bork defeat and the Clarence Thomas hearing, presidents have tried to very hard nominate completely bland candidates. The candidates that are not going to get deep scrutiny. Candidates who don't have any sort of record or past that might create not smooth confirmation. So this will become more and more the case, particularly after this case. All right. Now, as I mentioned, in President Bush's last year in office, the economy takes a dive. We go into recession. it's a variety of possible reasons. I don't think it's the war. I think a lot of it has to do with the cyclical nature of the economy, but also I mentioned that with the base closures and the cutting of defense contracts, that meant a lot of people were unemployed, and the private sector just didn't immediately absorb all these people. So we were looking at a recession, and it meant that the government was going to be in deficit, and Bush, didn't want that. And so he is going to repeal or he's going to push for and get a repeal of some of Reagan's tax cuts. And he had in the campaign back in '88, he had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." All right, like he was like, "I'm not going to vote to raise taxes," right? And he said this over and over again. Well, then he did. Then he voted to raise, or he passed a bill that raised taxes. And so he was caught. Now, he explained that he had to change his mind, that this was necessary to try to reach more balanced budgets and get the economy on the right track. But, man, conservatives crucified him for this. You're going to talk about 20 million people not voting for him who probably would have voted for him in the next election, right? So that's a big deal. Meanwhile, you have this sort of random amendment finally get ratified. And this was an amendment originally proposed by James Madison that said you don't get to give yourself a pay raise as a member of Congress while you're that session. So like if you vote in March to give Congress a pay raise, you do not get to have the effect of the pay raise till a whole new Congress has had a chance to be reelected. So you got to go home and explain why you gave yourself a pay raise. That's what it boils down to your constituents. And that's the last amendment we've added to the Constitution, 27. So be familiar with President Bush, and I'm going to close this one, and we're going to jump right into the election of 1992. So let me share. Yeah. All right. So let's present. And when I was your age, this term was all the rage right here. So we've now been living with this concept for the last 20 years, right? But, this is an idea that was started back when like James K. Polk wanted to have low taxes, right? The idea that we should all be one global commerce system. Free trade advocates finally got what they wanted. This is it. And it will come fully to fruition under Bill Clinton. So I mentioned that Bush is going to not get votes because of the guy in the middle. Now, that is H. Ross Perot. Ross Perot was a Texan, and he was a billionaire. He created the company Texas Instruments. You may have heard of it, TI, Texas Instruments. He'd also been involved in clandestine operations with the CIA. So he was a smart guy. But he really sounded country. When Ross Perot talked, it sounded like this. All right. And so he had a very unusual persona, but he hammered away on Bush on the deficit. That was his hobby horse, man. I grew up listening to Perot talk about the deficit. And he hammered away on Clinton for supporting a free trade agreement with Mexico. He said, if they pass this North American free trade agreement, the sound you will hear is a giant sucking sound of American jobs going south. All right. So he was very much against a treaty that President Bush had signed, had negotiated, but whoever became president would actually have to sign it. Right. So the treaty hadn't been ratified yet. The Senate hadn't passed it. And so Perot ran against primarily NAFTA and budget deficits. Okay. And enter Clinton. Now, Clinton was I think he was a 2-term governor of Arkansas. And he was known in Arkansas, for a variety of things. One, as a womanizer. He already had a reputation as being somebody who had extramarital affairs, which was true. It was accurate. But perhaps more importantly, he was known as a centrist Democrat. He had helped create, as a governor of Arkansas, the Democratic Leadership Council. So the DLC were, for lack of a better word, moderate to center-right Democrats. So they're kind of remind me of Republican lights. And by that, I mean the victory of Ronald Reagan isn't just in Ronald Reagan's, it's the entire political spectrum shifts to the right. Now, we as Americans, are somewhat clueless on the political spectrum, but let me show you what I'm talking about, and maybe this will make more sense. So Clinton recognized that that liberalism of the version of there it is. Here we go. uh, sorry, liberalism of the type of, Ted Kennedy and those guys wasn't getting it done, right? Like Americans had turned away from that. So to give you another way of looking at it, when you think about where modern Democrats like Bush, Obama, and Clinton are right here. So historically, this would be the conservative side of the political spectrum. And somebody like Bernie Sanders would be like down here. Or Ted Kennedy would be further over here. So Clinton recognized the closer you can get to here, the more you're going to be able to do what he called triangulation. Triangulation is to take the best ideas from the Democrats and the best ideas from the Republicans and pull them together. And that way you can be in the center. And he tried to govern that way, although he's going to make some terrible goofs out the gate. And we'll talk about that. Now, he wasn't a political novice. Like I said, he'd been governor of Arkansas a couple of times. He apprenticed under Senator Fulbright, who I taught y'all about back during the Vietnam War. He was a Rhodes Scholar to England during the war. So he wasn't a foolish kind of guy. He was what we might call in high school a band geek. And his stepfather used to beat his mama. And he grew up trying to defend her from that. So he had a lot of sort of, even though this guy was brilliant, he had a sort of like white trash background, you put it bluntly. I don't know how else to describe that. But so when the election comes, you can see it's a pretty close race, right? The difference is this guy. This guy attracts 20 million votes, right? Ross Perot. And the argument goes, the people who mostly voted for Perot were conservative. They didn't like the free trade agreement. They didn't like the deficits, and they didn't like Bush's economy, right? And so they didn't want to vote for some liberal hippie. Now, that's how Clinton was depicted by conservatives. It's like this draft dodging, hippie. Not really accurate, but, if you could have gone to Vietnam or Oxford, I think a lot of people would have opted for Oxford. The point being is that Bush didn't get reelected, and I think probably because of the economy, okay? No, yeah. Well, Perot really had the thing about Perot, and I give him a lot of credit for this, is he changed the dialogue. Nobody was talking about deficits in '92 until Perot comes along, and Perot really makes like both candidates, Bush and Clinton, really have to discuss the deficit. I mean, Clinton would like to have been more liberal. He would have liked to have spent more money, and done all that kind of stuff. But he knows that that's outside of the norm right now. And so Clinton is always about doing what was politically smart, in terms of triangulation. Keep that in mind. All right. Now, the first thing that he's going to get a chance to do, or one of the first things he's going to get a chance to do, is appoint the second Supreme Court female justice. And so that's RBG. He appoints Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court. He will also appoint Justice Breyer. This is Stephen Breyer. So if you're looking at the court, this is Chief Justice Rehnquist's court. Now, Rehnquist used to be the sole conservative back in the Nixon era, right? But now he has a 7-2 conservative advantage. So if you're looking at the court, you got Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Oh, it's 6-3, because you got John Paul Stevens. So you got RBG, John Paul Stevens, and Breyer, and then the other 5 are conservatives, okay? Turns out later, both Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Kennedy will become swing votes. So the court actually grows tighter during this presidency, okay? So be aware of Justice Ginsburg, certainly. I would know her. Now, I told you out the gate, Clinton kind of makes some, I think, tactical mistakes. I don't necessarily disagree with what he did, per se. I just think that the optics of it were terrible. And by far the first one that got him in so much controversy was he changed the federal military's code of behavior. So for all of the history of the code of behavior for the U.S. Armed Forces was, if you were discovered to be a homosexual in the armed forces, you would be dishonorably discharged. All right. And so Clinton made what, in retrospect, seems like a moderate kind of decision. And that is he ordered the military to no longer ask that on like questionnaires and things like that. Like, are you or have you been a homosexual? And at the same time, don't tell. Now, at the time, this is the kind of cartoons you would see. Seeing all your decorations, it's obvious you serve bravely and honorably. What's your rank? Second-class citizen, right? Because they're gay. But I got to tell you, when I remember this, man, it got a huge outcry, like in terms of Clinton is soft on gays, he's going to screw up the military forever. And so this was like really controversial. And I think if you think about politically, act like doing something that benefits gay rights is not going to in any way endear yourself to the right.
Yeah,
you understand? So that's that was kind of like narrow casting, and I think in terms of timing, the optics were bad. Now I don't disagree that people shouldn't be discriminated against, but perhaps his biggest first-term failure came here. Now you got to understand the Clintons; they had an extraordinarily interesting relationship. This is Hillary Rodham Clinton. So Hillary Clinton was a active Democrat, probably even before Bill Clinton was. She actually was a staffer on the Watergate investigation committee. She worked to help impeach or bring charges against President Nixon. So she was very much an Illinois liberal. And when she moved to Arkansas, she never quite became like an Arkansas person, like a rural Southerner. And nonetheless, because of her ambition, she wants to be president one day. She will have a partnership with Bill Clinton. They're kind of like two tracks. And so when all of these extramarital affairs and stuff have kind of come to light, they've kind of worked out a deal where it's, I don't want to hear about it. You understand? If it becomes public, it's your butt. So Clinton had just come off multiple allegations of sexual impropriety during the campaign. And she kind of has him, I'd say, in the doghouse. And so she wants and gets the most significant role a first lady has ever had while being first lady. Okay. She's appointed the chairman of the National Healthcare Reform Commission. So it is her commission that will propose healthcare reform in America. Right. Well, the problem is the staffers are afraid to cross her because she's the president's wife. Right. And congressmen were kind of like, how do we treat her? She's the first lady. We can't do what we might normally do. So they kind of don't necessarily do that. But then when she proposes what she proposes, which is by no means universal health care, but it's what we call the public option, it dies instantly, And so now her credibility is destroyed as far as within the White House. And so she's mad at Bill Clinton. Their personal life is full of strife during this. Okay. But unfortunately, I guess for the country, we don't have any healthcare reform. So if you think about Obama coming in, right, that's been a key issue on the Democratic sort of to-do list since the days of Harry Truman, right? And it's still there to some degree. Okay. So the greatest thing I think Bill Clinton does, and it's ironic because Dems have never fully capitalized on this. I think it's because it's a conflict in their identity. Bill Clinton will actually push for and work with Congress. They'll push to a deficit reduction package. Now, some of that's Ross Perot. I got to give him credit, right? But they're going to pass a law called the Budget Reconciliation Act, right? And what it does is they're going to start raising taxes on the richest, okay, but cutting spending, right? So the absolute thing nobody gets to do anymore, right? Raise taxes on the wealthy, cut spending, and then what is that going to do? Well, this is the deficit is shrinking. That's the peace dividend. He's cutting military spending and raising taxes, right? And by his last 4 years in office, or 3 years in office, carried into the fourth year, 4 years of budget surplus, right? So that's paying off the national debt. Well, man, that is going to send investors like soaring. Their confidence is going to go through the roof. So everything that Clinton does bad is sort of wiped away by his economic policies. And his economic policies are going to really also, interestingly enough, dovetail with another thing he does: get tough on crime. So Clinton is going to push for and get it's called the crime bill. That's the name of it, the crime bill. And it'll involve things like mandatory sentencing. Okay. Now, by the way, the guy who wrote this bill's name is Joe Biden. And this will come back to haunt Joe Biden in the primaries this past year because tons of African Americans are going to go to prison under this. You understand? Yeah. And so black voters will be like, man, it was your bill that really did mass incarceration. And that created a lot of debate. But you don't have to have me tell you, here's the 90s, right? Look at this. Look at it skyrocket. coupling with the war on drugs, 3 strikes you're outlaws, man, violent crime is just crushed under this. Now, the argument goes, maybe it's not the crime that goes away because of arrests, although there's certainly a lot of them, but the economy is doing so well, maybe that's less need for criminals. You know what I mean? You're less likely to be a criminal if you're pleasantly employed. So if you look down here at the 90s, you'll see that the crime rate drops precipitously. Like it dives off. Now, perhaps most controversially during this will be the passage. Now, this bill right here is actually part of this bill. But first is the 1993 Brady Law. And so remember I told you about James Brady was the press secretary for President Reagan who got paralyzed, right? So what better way to shroud a handgun bill, which, by the way, was supported by President Reagan, than in Reagan's secretary's name, right? His press secretary. So this is the Brady bill, and it created the National Criminal Background Database. You know, like whenever you go to buy a gun, they're going to do a criminal background check on you before they sell it to you. Well, that's what this did. It also created a waiting period. So, you just couldn't immediately purchase a weapon. All right. But by far more controversial even than the Brady bill is the assault weapons ban, because it defines what assault weapons are literally by item. You know, like this is an assault weapon. This is an assault weapon. You know, it's like a huge list. I couldn't possibly print it for you or show it to you, but it's lots and lots of types of guns that are banned. They get grandfathered, that the ones that are not. In other words, there are a lot of guns that are permitted because you already owned them. They were already in circulation. And you can see things like the pistol grip, guns like Tech-9s and Uzis, machine guns like the AK-47. And of course, I don't want to get into this class. We'll get into it next year, the debate about gun control. But at the time, these two bills, coupled with the crime bill, seem to be having a successful outcome. Now, this bill that you see here in 94 will expire in 2004. Protagonists of the bill, supporters of the bill will say this will reduce mass shootings. Opponents of the bill will say less than 1% of the types of mass shootings occur as a result of these types of guns. So there's a heated debate that rages, of course, led by the NRA, about whether or not these kind of bills do anything at all to crime or not, or to reducing illegal actions by firearms. But I would say that, regardless, Clinton has this sort of reputation during the period of being proactive on crime. So here you have a tough on crime, balancing the budget, reducing deficits, Democrat, right? Like that doesn't really jive with the narrative usually. And then things start to get ugly in the domestic front. So this up here is an event called Ruby Ridge. It actually happened during President Bush's last year in office, when ATF agents and the FBI raided a compound in Idaho where a family lived, where they believed that they had weapons they weren't supposed to and stuff. And during the ensuing shootout, it was very clear that this person wasn't engaging in criminal acts. Like there was nothing criminal really at Ruby Ridge. And his family got killed. His wife and son were shot. And so that really, and they end up paying a reparation of like $3 million for the government screwed up, and lots of what are called sovereign citizen or militia groups saw that and became very concerned. Like they're like, the federal government raided this guy's house and killed his family. They're unhappy about that. They're concerned about particularly the government's law enforcement agencies. Okay. Then came this terrible event. And so this is down in Waco, Texas. You had a religious sort of, I don't know how you call these, other than cult. They were a religious sort of unusual group focused on one leader named David Koresh. Now, David Koresh was an arms dealer, a gun dealer. He had transmitted firearms illegally. Now, some of it he'd done legally, but in other words, he wasn't a licensed gun dealer. He had to go sell to licensed gun dealers. And he got on the ATF's radar. Like this guy he had dozens of people living in this religious compound, and they were heavily armed. And so the ATF and the FBI start investigating David Koresh, and they're called the Branch Davidians. That's their religious organization. And they're like digging in, and the FBI argues that, this is a situation we can deal with peacefully. The FBI negotiator. And the ATF's like, no way, this guy's a danger to America, and we need to go in hard. And so the question goes to Attorney General Janet Reno. She's President Clinton's Attorney General, who was a tough on crime kind of, Attorney General. And so she gives them the permission to do a heavy raid, like an actual, incursion, like go into the compound. When they go in, they put tear gas in the buildings of the compound. They're flammable. Now there's a shootout, and then it catches on fire, and all the children inside are burned to death. It's just an absolute nightmare scenario. So again, it looks like the government has totally gotten carried away. Keep in mind, several federal agents are like, this is something that is not necessary. We don't have to have a violent standoff. We can resolve this just by talking, right? And so that is going to create this, well, it doesn't create, but throughout the country in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Idaho, you have a lot of these militia groups that have been being formed in the 80s and 90s. And two of their members are going to do this. And this will probably be one of the most tragic events in American domestic terrorism in American history. So this is the worst act of domestic terrorism. On this, I think it's a corner, but I don't remember which corner. On one of these corners, this is a federal office building in Oklahoma City. It's called the Murrah Federal Building. And so in it, you have offices of the Bureau of ATF and FBI. So, the guys that did Ruby Ridge and Waco are in this building. And so these two guys plan and bring a truck bomb and park it here, and it blows the entire front of the building up. I mean, it obliterates the building. And so when this happens, to give credit, President Clinton as consoler in chief gets a lot of credit. Like Reagan, he's very good at being emotional and sensitive. Like, I feel your pain. He really makes you feel like he believes you. And so he gave a good speech that night after the attack, because in this attack, a nursery is blown up in it. Like infants and small baby children are destroyed killed in this attack. So McVeigh will be tried for federal crime and executed, Tim McVeigh. And Terry Nichols is now serving a life sentence. And so in our country, there are plenty of Americans who believe that not only is the government not for you, but the government is your enemy. And so, my fear in America, certainly pre 9/11, was domestic terrorism. Not like I personally was that afraid of it, but I believe that the greatest danger to our ultimate security comes from within. It comes from domestic terrorists killing us. And this was a good example of it. If you ever get out to Oklahoma City, these chairs represent every person killed there at the building, at the federal building. Okay. All right. So I told you that Clinton kind of did poorly initially, right? 92 and 93. Meanwhile, coming out of Georgia was one of the most skilled congressmen maybe of all time. This gentleman he's got a PhD in history. He's Dr. Newt Gingrich, right? So Newt Gingrich was a real student of history, and he had, with a handful of his important leaders, come up with a plan for how Republicans across the nation would get elected. And so you can see it here in his hand, and you can see it here. It was called the Contract with America, right? And it literally was a checklist of things that Republicans, if elected, would check off. Like, it's our to-do list. This is our contract. If we're elected, we'll do this stuff. And they deliver on a lot of it. All right. Well, he'll create a Republican tide. That's what we call it, national tide election. And the Republicans will take over the House and the Senate. And that hadn't happened in forever. So they're going to be like the majority party in the House and the Senate. He'll become the Speaker of the House. And he's going to get a lot of stuff passed. And so Clinton recognizes, so a lot of these things that you saw up here, even this was passed, before that election. And he's like, I've got to work with these people. Okay. Because otherwise, I'm not going to be very successful. So probably the most ugly and divisive issue that Reagan didn't quite finish, but he certainly brought it to the public attention, was the use of the phrase welfare queen. So during the 80s and 70s, there was a federal assistance program. So let me just see if I can see number of welfare programs a person can receive. So the most famous at the time was a program called AFDC. AFDC. And that's called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. You hear that? AFDC. And so if you looked at how the 80s sort of progressed, AFDC was one of the largest sort of outlays that the government made. And so this became the one that was most controversial. AFDC was basically a federal benefit to help mothers, aid to families with dependent children, right? And therefore, it created a sort of bizarre situation where a mother would receive more money the more children she had. So it was an incentive, in essence, to not work and to have children. Now, the stereotype of the welfare queen is completely unfounded for most recipients of welfare. In other words, this was a lady who was depicted as, and this was these two ladies actually are welfare queens. Like they're the real thing. But unfortunately, those two ladies became the stereotype for all welfare recipients, which is categorically not the case. But nonetheless, AFDC was huge. You need 33 billion. Food stamps threw in another 18 billion. And so what Clinton decided to do, reluctantly at first, and then fully supported. Like initially, it was kind of like, this is like a sacred cow of Democrats, welfare benefits. But he said, you know what? Let's go forward. And so in 1996, with Newt Gingrich, he signed into law the Welfare Reform Act. And man, so when I hear people talking about this stuff, I'm like, maybe briefly during things like the recession with Obama, when welfare benefits were extended, but not since 96. 96 redefined how welfare works. So it's full, this is the full name, Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, but simply called the Welfare Act, all right? And it wanted to change the nature of poverty in America. Lifetime limits on benefits. So you don't get benefits for more than 5 years, okay, period. Money is now run by the states, and perhaps the biggest change is a change from AFDC to something called TANF. All right, so from AFDC to TANF. And TANF is, as it says, the temporary, I'll put it up here, temporary assistance for needy families. So the key here is temporary, right? So you cannot live on welfare forever, okay? Now, there are lots of types of benefits that welfare recipients can receive. So let me show you major welfare programs. And then you can ask yourself, is that something you want to get rid of? Like aid to children at food. So here's now what the major, thank you, Bill Clinton and Republican Congress, key welfare benefits are. I'll pop it up here. Ooh. So Medicaid is the healthcare plan for low-income people, right? So that's just so you can be treated at the hospital or treated at the doctor's office. That's Medicaid. We know what that is. TANF, we already did that one, right? So we know what TANF is. That's welfare, in terms of getting assistance. The Earned Income Tax Credit is very popular. That's actually a Republican-created plan. That means at the end of the year when we pay taxes, if your income was so low, you actually get a check from the government to meet the poverty level. So that's rather than get, monthly benefits, you just, in your bank account, there's a deposit called the Earned Income Tax Credit, and tax credits make more sense. But by and large, it's for disabled people and for housing. And SNAP is food stamp programs for children, mostly, like free and reduced lunch and things like that. So welfare will be dramatically reduced under this bill. So make sure you understand that, all right? I love this lady's expression, right? I don't know if she's happy about this bill being signed or not. She's got a look on her face like, are you kidding me? Nonetheless, Clinton's all happy. And this is the best example I can give you of triangulation. Under what president did we reduce and change welfare? Oh, a Democrat, all right? So another requirement is you have to do job training. No more bumps for children, no more rewards for having more kids, right? and it will dramatically reduce. Now, I pulled up a sort of liberal opposition to the welfare reform bill, and what the opposition to it would say is not unexpected. People don't make nearly as much money as they used to, and that's a fact. You can see here a whole lot less in terms of cash benefits, a whole lot less of children benefits. So, it is true. Our welfare rolls have dramatically reduced. What that's just led is a nation that are more poor. That's the argument. It's just more poverty in America. But this was delighted by a lot of Americans, particularly Republicans. All right. But then they got carried away. And this is where I think, the price of power got to Newt Gingrich. Gingrich is going to then target Medicare and education bills to reduce them. And now, guys, Medicare is old people. You start reducing Medicare benefits, well, old people get mad. And so Clinton refused to let him do it. He would not pass a budget that had cuts to Medicare and education. And so Newt then shut down the federal government. In other words, when the bill came to fund the budget, and we didn't sign it, there was no compromise. And Clinton was gambling here. He was gambling that America would side with him over the Speaker of the House. And he was right. He's going to become more popular after this, and Gingrich is going to become less popular. And so here you can see how the Gingrich stole Christmas, and Newt's Uncle Scrooge. And it shows, it costs billions of dollars every time we shut down the federal government. Okay. So this backfired, and Clinton is going to win comfortably in an election against a super duper conservative Kansan and a great veteran named Bob Dole. Bob Dole was kind of, I think, in many ways put up there as the sacrificial lamb because you can see Clinton's going to win enormous percentages of votes. Ross Perot's going to run again as a Reform Party candidate, which he created. He's going to quit for a period of time, then restart, and it just never goes anywhere. He doesn't get the number of votes that he got last time around, 8 million votes. And Clinton is very popular. You can see the Solid South votes for Bob Dole, and the West, where he's from, and then everywhere else votes for Clinton. And so Clinton easily sails into reelection, okay? Meanwhile, coming out of California is our first of overt attacks by states on affirmative action. So California eliminates affirmative action altogether, says you can't do it at all. And that story has pretty much been played out today. But the 90s and 2000s, that was kind of like, how do we do affirmative action? Well, the answer is you don't really get to do it, because any way that involves admissions. So this was giving admissions benefit, so to speak, to people of color. You can see for African Americans, they dropped by almost 10% in admissions, 9% for Native Americans, Latinos, and then a small, modest raise for white and Asian. So lots of anti-affirmative action coming out of California. At the same time, an issue that we're all too familiar with is going to rear its head during Clinton's presidency. And that is police and race violence, like this struggle between cops and inner city people particularly. And it's most embodied in a riot that occurs in Los Angeles after this footage of this guy. This is Rodney King. He was on drugs and raced away from being arrested. When they got him, he laid down on the ground, by the video, and then they started beating on him. These 4 police officers, they just wailed on him. Okay, an all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict to all 4 cops, and so that prompted the LA riots, right? And so you can see this narrative of black versus white with police particularly. And the idea of police brutality is nothing new, and it became heated during this event, this incident, right? But perhaps nothing in the history of my lifetime was more polarizing, more divisive than this case. So I'm one of the people who watched this case and was stunned by the outcome. O.J. Simpson this is an athlete and a TV star and movie star who was accused of murdering his ex-wife and her lover. And the court case proceeds, and he has like 5 super attorneys. They're like the best lawyers in America. And they do an amazing job of arguing a defense that that OJ is simply the victim of white racism on the police department of Los Angeles. Now, I ain't gonna lie to you. I believe there was certainly epidemic white racism in the LA cops, right? But I don't think that meant OJ didn't kill his wife. And so when this, I have a video I show my AP government class, but it's Oprah Winfrey, and she's hosting a crowd of people the day the verdict is read. Yeah, they're all watching. Right, and to watch white people response, which is like shock and crestfallen, and to watch black people's response, which is like celebration, it's really fascinating because basically everybody watched the same trial. So this is a really divisive issue, and I don't think OJ would ever appear on the AP exam, but it just shows you that this idea of black v. white, particularly in big cities that were, where the Great Migration occurred, is very, very heavy. Okay. And keep in mind, there's a lot of hostility during this period by blacks because of the crime bill, right? Like they consider this unfair because policing usually falls harder on them. Now, that being said, Clinton has no problem getting black support. In fact, it is during this period that really, you can go back and see the year the Civil Rights Act was passed, but some people have even joked that Bill Clinton was the first black president because his support by African Americans was so deep and so strong that block is almost unbreakable, right? And so the key for Democrats, which I think it's been difficult, is how to not alienate white voters while still making sure that black voters' needs are met too. And that's been the Democrats' tightrope. Now, I ain't gonna lie to you, Republicans have made very little effort overall to encourage black support. I think there are some black candidates out there like Herman Cain, who's since passed away, who argue that if the Republicans would actually make an effort, there are conservative black people, but that they just don't feel like there's very much effort on their part. So let's get back to why Clinton is usually ranked pretty high. And Clinton usually does rank pretty high in political rankings, presidential rankings. The fella here that you're looking at is the Raging Cajun. That's James Carville. He is a professor and graduate of Louisiana State University, LSU. So they call him the Raging Cajun. And he was Bill Clinton's principal advisor on the campaign trail. And so whenever Clinton got off talking about some random thing, he had a sign that would remind him, what's the most important thing in American mind? It's the economy, stupid. Right? So I've written here a list for you to recognize why the 90s were so booming. Okay? Because really, the late 80s will carry into this, but it will skyrocket. I mean, the mid 80s will carry, and you had a downturn in the late 80s, Bush recession. And now in the 90s, the economy is going to just roar for the whole decade. And the first is low interest rates. Once Volcker killed the specter of high, once he got high inflation cut, we hadn't really had any since. All right. By far, what I consider the most important, because I consider most of the economy not the product of the government, but is the billions of dollars in wealth that was created in the 90s. This was when the internet was developed. This is when Amazon became a company for the first, this is like everything that we're comfortable with now were called startups. So these were .coms, right? This is when, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and those guys started doing what they did, Microsoft and Apple. Yeah, right. So all of the economy was becoming driven, or a huge amount of the economy was being driven by the tech sector. And so it was prosperous, to say the least. People were getting paid relatively well, relatively. Low inflation. The government under Clinton, believe it or not, particularly the banking sector, is going to deregulate it. So this is going to spur heavy investment. They got rid of Glass-Steagall, which was the thing that separated investment banks from like commercial lending banks. So, when you went to put your money in a bank, you wouldn't think that was going to be invested in the stock market necessarily or whatever. Well, now it could be. Down the road, that's going to get carried away and lead to the Great Recession. Okay. But at the time, it was cool for investors. And of course, investors were very confident because DC seemed to have their act together. And then obviously world trade allowed us to trade all over the place and make a whole lot of money. So looking back at Clinton, for most people, it's the economy, even when he gets impeached. So I mentioned NAFTA, and Clinton is going to lose a lot of support because of this, because the largest vocal opponents to NAFTA were either like protectionists like Ross Perot or labor unions. And they knew that the type of work that would be outsourced under NAFTA, like to Mexico, was the type of work we did right down the road here in Fielddale, making furniture, or down the road here at Dan River Mills. And that's exactly what happened. Ross Perot predicted it, and it happened. Now, Clinton and Bush were both free trade advocates. So if you were voting, there was no daylight between the two of them. Clinton talked about making sure labor guarantees would be in the bill. Didn't happen. All right. So in the end, many people believe Clinton was more of a representative of Wall Street than Main Street. His friends at Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. But I think it was a mixture. And I think Clinton recognized that the future of America's economy had to be on something more than low-skilled labor. And so he pioneered that with he and Bush both, and Reagan. Reagan started it too. Reagan did the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with America. So he was the first really to do this. And then Clinton went even further and both created and signed the World Trade Organization. So the WTO would be headquartered, I forget where it's headquartered. I almost said like Geneva or something like that. But in 1999, during Clinton's presidency, there was the round of discussions of the WTO in Seattle. And it met with huge protests. I mean, they blocked, all the streets were blocked, and it was a massive protest. But in the end, WTO is here to stay, at least as of my lifetime. And so what the WTO does is it's like a UN for commercial exchange, for trade. So when President Trump or now Biden has a problem with China, rather than get into some sort of brutal trade war, we try to negotiate it with the WTO, like figure out how to solve our trade disputes rather than, heavy, burdensome, really trade disputes. Okay. Now, I mentioned this, and like I said, this is usually the kind of stuff looking back that people are like, wow, Clinton was managed to able to keep people relatively happy while cutting the deficit. That's pretty remarkable. And you can see by the time he left office, we had a surplus. And we never had that, in my lifetime. That was crazy, up until those points. Now, another thing that was going on during the 90s was a change in outlook, a change in attitude. In the 1950s, it was completely sort of unexpected for a married woman with a child to work. Think about the 50s, right? Like that's the stay-at-home mom. That's the whole idea of the Leave It to Beaver generation, right? But if you start to look up here, by the 90s, lots of married women now working, right? Lots, as in what's that, 60%, right? Single women, 70%. Okay. And so the labor force participation was huge. And you had an interesting cultural phenomenon. I remember it. This actress, Candice Bergen, was playing a journalist on TV called Murphy Brown. And Murphy Brown was unwed and having a child proudly. This was not as a grown-up woman. She was happy to be having a baby. And the vice president of the United States at the time under President Bush was a guy named Dan Quayle. And he called her, a tramp, the character, a tramp, because she was a bad influence for women everywhere. And today, you think about unmarried women, single moms, that's like not at all unusual, but that was a cultural shift and probably driven by the need for women to work in the workforce, right? There was a great movie with Dolly Parton in it called 9 to 5 about sexual harassment. And yeah, so this was an interesting period for women. And of course, while the pink collar expanded, the biggest problem for American working women was the gender pay gap. So here's the best you can do, ladies, is over here in the orange, right? And that's controlled, meaning you're supposed to have the same pay, and even then they don't. Like they made measures to pay the same, right? But if there are no measures present, then here you go, ladies, 69 cents to the male dollar. So we call this the gender inequality or gender pay gap. And so today, this is the area where many feminists are most active at demanding the end of sexual harassment, right? And you can think about in recent years, we've had a fairly large movement to try to expose sexual predators and people who are guilty of sexual harassment, but also trying to end this pink collar pay inequity or pay inequality. Now, one of the things that Clinton did, I think, as a response to women, but also to families in general, is the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. And today, this is very, very popular. This is paid family leave for a variety of reasons. So if you have to stop working for a period of time, like when my two boys were born, I was allowed to take sick days and just stay home with them, take care of my kids and my wife because of FMLA. Not maternity leave for me, but this way, if your grandma is ill and you have to take her to the doctor, you don't get fired for that. So this is a guaranteed way to help take care of families, as an example of the changing dynamic of family. Right? A lot more women in the workforce, right? And a lot more need to miss work for a variety of reasons, for kids or whatnot. Now, if I had to pinpoint where Clinton's there's two things that Clinton does badly. One is his absolutely abuse of the obligation of how to behave as a president. Now, there are other presidents who misbehave, but what he does is really despicable, and that's why a lot of people don't like him. He'll get the nickname Slick Willie, during that period. The other is his foreign policy, but I don't quite blame him. Clinton had no background in foreign policy. You understand? Like, he's a governor of Arkansas, and the Cold War was over, and we really hadn't reached a definitive what is our policy yet. You know what I'm saying? And so we're going to have a sequence of events that are, I'm going to say, pretty bad. So starting in Somalia, right? So in Somalia in 1994, the country had, or three, excuse me, 1993, because actually Bush had sent our forces there. President Bush had deployed, he called them peacekeeping forces. You got to realize that if there's no peace, you can't really keep it, right? So he had deployed the 10th Mountain Division, and President Clinton did not want a big military footprint anywhere. Like, that was very much his concern, was that he did not want America to get into a war when he would be perceived as the rookie. So he sent in our elite special forces. So he sent in Navy SEALs, Delta Forces, and the U.S. Rangers, right? These are the most elite fighting squads in American military. And they go in, and he gives them a very specific order: capture and reduce the effectiveness of the Mogadishu warlord, Mohammed Farah Aidid. So Farah Aidid was like one of these warlords in Mogadishu in Somalia who was taking United Nations food and using it as ransom. He was using famine as a weapon. So, yeah, I mean, this is a very humanitarian reason to go put this thug down, right? So we go over there, and the problem is Farah Aidid is like in basically a castle, which is the Bakara market of Mogadishu. So like this part of Mogadishu is like completely his battleground, his area. So we send in an elite group of soldiers in the daylight to capture them. And the leader, the general at the time, General Garrison, asks for Washington to authorize a heavier commitment of forces like tanks and, AC Spectre gunships, the big gunship planes. And Clinton's administration's like, nah, that'll be too visible. And so our helicopters get shot down in Mogadishu. And on CNN, you could turn on the TV, and there were like American Delta Force snipers stripped naked being carried through the city, right? And in the middle of the day, like, oh, what's going on? And after that, Clinton was like, we're out of here. Like, this was an embarrassment because we really weren't committed fully to it. And so we call this Operation Gothic Serpent, but it was a terrible fiasco, right? So that's not very good. Well, after he gets burnt on that in 93, he ain't going to touch this. Now, by law, if there is a genocide occurring, America is supposed to intervene, by our own laws. Well, the question is, the president has to declare a genocide. So routinely in press conferences, he'll say that the Hutus were engaged in genocidal actions. He won't actually say there is a genocide. Clinton was a whole lawyer and law professor, and he's good at splitting hairs. Like, what is the definition is? So tragically, these fairly, Rwanda had been a product of the Belgian imperialism, and the Belgians had created two ethnicities, the Hutus and the Tutsis, basically out of whole cloth. And then they had worked with the Tutsis. The Tutsis were the Belgian sort of like sepoys, if you know what those are, like they're worker bees, right? And when the Belgians left, the Hutus rose up for over 3 months and absolutely slaughtered the Tutsi minority. And ultimately, this thing will be ended by an incursion of the African Union. But we don't, and this was a warlord. Like, if these guys were wearing machetes. So, like, 10th Mountain Division would have owned this country, All right. But we didn't go there at all. All right. So that was Rwanda. Then there was this, and I remember this. I was in Greece when this happened in '99. No, I was there the first go around, '97 and or six. I can't remember. Anyway, I was in Greece sailing over to Bari, Italy, and I could actually hear what sounded like thunder, and it was cannons shelling. It was Herzegovina, it was Serbia, it was. So this guy right here, Slobodan Milosevic, was the former leader of Serbia, and at the time Yugoslavia was dissolving. And again, Clinton didn't want to have anything to do with this. And I was in France while this was going on, and I got attacked, practically approached by a woman speaking in French to me. I guess I have that look about me. But fussing at me and saying, "When will y'all do something?" Not y'all, but when will America do anything? And I was like, "What in the world is she talking about?" And it turns out she was talking about this. So there was this massive ethnic cleansing going on in Eastern Europe, and America wasn't doing anything. So finally, NATO convinces Clinton to authorize the use of air forces, and we literally bomb Milosevic to surrender. We annihilate their military, but not before a large population of the Bosnian Muslims have been killed. It's a real bummer. Clinton's greatest success, although I would argue it's temporary, is getting a second round of Camp David Accords. So this is Camp David. This is Oslo, Norway. And this is the terrorist leader of the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat had been a bad guy forever, as far as I knew, growing up. And so here he has the guy who's, now, by the way, today the descendants of the PLO are the Fatah, which are the opposite of Hamas. So if you know anything about what's going on in the news today, Hamas is bombing Israel, right? Well, the PLO are the guys who are trying to create an independent state. And Clinton brokers a two-state negotiation, both in '93 and later in 2000. And this paves the way for progress, okay? Although still hadn't solved that problem, as you might imagine. And in the other area where I consider Clinton not necessarily guilty of mishandling it, but not putting enough effort on it. So this guy right here, Osama bin Laden, had actively created this organization called Al-Qaeda and had been driven out of Sudan. Now, we launched missiles into Sudan to try to get this guy under Clinton and missed. We blew up an aspirin factory. Oops. But the government of Sudan, which is by no means a nice government, kicked him out. They're like, we don't want this kind of bad press. We don't want this attention. So he ends up in Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban. And, while in Afghanistan, this is our U.S. embassy. Actually, this was a place in Saudi Arabia where American workers work. It's called the Khobar Towers. He then has two of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania attacked. And most infamously, up until this point, the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. And so all of these were plotted by Al-Qaeda. So Clinton was pursuing this guy as a means of law enforcement. So he was America's most wanted criminal. He was the number one most wanted criminal in 2000, right, by the FBI. And they were pursuing him as an international criminal, a terrorist, because he doesn't belong to a nation state. And so we knew he was a bad guy. But, boy, will we really know he's a bad guy in a year, right? Yeah. Now, amidst all of it, and Clinton was probably one of the first presidents I remember who, like, the other side absolutely despised. Like, they just despised him. And I never quite understood it. But one of the things they got wind of through an investigation was it seemed possible that President Clinton and his wife had engaged, while governor of Arkansas, in a shady real estate deal. Like, in other words, they had used their office to kind of get this place called Whitewater, which was a resort that they were trying to build, or a housing thing where people would build nice houses. Turns out, by the way, all at the end of the story, all they did was bad investments. Like, they didn't actually do anything criminal at all at Whitewater. But in the meantime, Clinton appointed a special prosecutor. That's what you do when you want to be, I don't have anything to do with it. Justice Department appointed a special prosecutor. And to make sure it didn't seem like him picking a guy that would be a Democrat, they picked a very conservative judge named Kenneth Starr. And that's who this is. And Judge Starr, under the Whitewater investigation, had a very broad latitude for, like, getting into the president's stuff and seeing if he did anything illegal. And so while he was conducting that investigation, he discovered that, remember the government shutdown back in '96? Yep. During that government shutdown, this young lady had told her good friend on a phone conversation that she had had oral relations, let's say, with the President of the United States in the White House, had a sexual activity with her. All right, well, that's kind of noteworthy. Then it came out that there was the dress she's wearing actually is stained with him, so to speak. All right, we'll leave it at that. So Starr, subpoenas her and a whole bunch of other witnesses. Meanwhile, Clinton is testifying in a different sexual harassment case. All right, he's been accused by multiple women of sexual harassment, and he's testifying in it, and he lies in that investigation, right? So while he's being investigated, he comes and stands on this podium with Hillary right beside him and says, I want to look right in the American people's eye and tell you, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky, right? And it turns out he did. Now, the problem isn't that he did. I mean, that is a problem, but it's in Bill Clinton world, that's a typical problem. Like he did that all the time. The problem is he's accused of perjury, which means lying under oath in his criminal inquiry about sexual assault, So he and then the other thing is obstruction of justice, like getting some of your friends to not testify because you might get in trouble. Well, this is one of those foregone conclusion impeachments where, the Dems were never going to vote to convict, and, the Repubs were going to vote to convict. And in the end, he was acquitted. He was ruled, not guilty. And, his popularity rating when he left office, even after being impeached, was really high. It stayed high, and it's still high. And I think a lot of that has to do with how people who lived through the 90s remember the comfort level of it. Because that, to me, is like the last decade where Americans felt kind of comfortable. Ever since then, there's been this sort of creeping sense of dread. And for some people, it started in the 90s. If your job got outsourced in the 90s, you didn't like this guy at all, right? But nonetheless, he's going to leave office very popular. And his, I'm going to change to a different PowerPoint. Oh, we're not going to make it. So let me just show you. I put this PowerPoint online, but I wanted to show you all Bush real quick. So, yeah. So the election of 2000 is the most controversial election in history. And I know supporters of President Trump would argue, wait a minute, we got a stolen election here. Sorry, I don't buy it. I do buy, though, that the election of 2000 was extremely close. All right, so this doesn't show it, but it shows it here. So down in the good state of Florida, you have what was called a butterfly ballot, which is a thing that folded like this. And you had to poke a hole through your candidates. And if you look carefully up here, in your first count of ballot was George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And then your second was Al Gore. And your third was the Libertarians. And then you come over here and there's the Reform Party, Pat Buchanan. So you had a bunch of nice ladies who, and Jewish particularly down in Miami Beach and others, they're like, the second candidate is Al Gore. I should hit the second button, or I should push my thing to the second button. Well, it turned out they're voting for Pat Buchanan, a noted anti-Semite, right? So all these Jewish voters down in Florida voted for this anti-Semitic guy. Well, that's their problem. That's user error, right? But the other problem is these things. So these were old machines, right? And you guys ever, had one of these things be full right here and not be able to crush it down very much? Well, that's what that thing is. And so what you had in the recount was these little holes hadn't fallen out all the way. And by the way, the name of that little piece of paper hole is called a chad. So you would have dimpled chads, right? Which means they were pushed down but didn't come out all the way. You'd have hanging chads, which is the paper was still attached. And then the question was, does that count or not as a vote? So, of course, Florida, which was like by a couple of thousand votes, had to have a manual recount. Bush sues Gore because Gore has asked for a manual recount in 3 counties. And Bush sues it. And the 3 counties he picks are like Miami, Miami-Dade, and like Andalusia or one of those. The problem is Gore makes a mistake here. Al Gore, he had run a good campaign, but this was a mistake. His guys picked 3 counties that they knew they would win in. Keep in mind, they're going up against state deadlines for when it has to be confirmed, so they can't actually do a manual recount of the entire state, right? So he picks 3 counties. Well, Gore gets sued by Bush, and the Supreme Court, in a hugely divided 5-4, 5 conservatives, 4 liberals, picks you can't do the recount because it's violation of equal protection. If you only do 3 counties, you're not doing the same for every other county. So in the end, Bush wins. But not without a shroud of controversy hanging over. Okay, so anyway, This PowerPoint's online. I don't think Bush will ever make it onto the exam, but if he does, it's 9/11. Okay, it's 9/11. That's what it's about. Yeah. And you should be familiar with it. Yeah.